Hello and welcome to this Remtech Talent Video podcast, and I'm delighted to introduce my colleague and friend Colin McLean, who is the Managing Director of Presentation Works, and this is a business of his, among other things that he does, that is orientated towards giving people presentation skills. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring Colin on today was to focus on the reality of today, which is that many of us are having to utilize video media when we're having meetings with other colleagues, but more particularly with interviews. And this is a reality now, not just for general communication, but specifically for interviews. And more companies are using them. And in fact, we've had quite a number of situations since the beginning of the COVID pandemic where people are doing the whole of their interview process via video conference. So it's a really important skill to get. So, Colin, thank you very much for joining us today and giving us some of the opinions, which I'm sure you'll give us, which will be really helpful to the people watching or listening to this. So kind of to kick off, Colin, I think, when we're thinking about presentation skills on camera, there's quite a lot of similarities to other things. And one of the things you and I discussed before was preparation. So maybe could you give us some ideas on your thoughts regarding how one prepares for this type of media when you're particularly having an interview via Zoom or Skype or Teams?
Yes, of course. I mean, we find ourselves in this online video-based world entirely by accident, as it were. And a year on, in physical terms of doing online interviews and things, we're still getting to grips with some of the challenges of this. But what I'd like to focus on in any thoughts that we have this morning are really the opportunities, some of the things that are not just opportunities, but even advantages to this particular medium. And the first, I think, Nigel, is really just the idea of setting your stage. It's how much you have thought about really how you're going to look and particularly how you're going to sound online. And there's a lot that you can do, and it can take some time if you're going to get it right. But it'll make a huge difference to how you come across if you've really thought about your stage, your setup. What are people going to be looking at? How are you lit? And in particular, as I say, the biggie for me is always audio. How do you sound? Because many a good video, and that includes streaming video, is, I'm afraid, ruined by poor audio. So that's the first step. That's a technical step, I admit. But it is an opportunity. You have the chance to be seen literally in your best light, whatever that is, wherever that happens to be in your home or office, which is not the case in the real world. You go along to somebody else's boardroom or their meeting room and it's very much their stage. So it can even be quite off-putting and in some cases even intimidating. Well, we can dispense with all of that in this particular environment by making sure that we've got our best foot forward in our best stage. So that's obviously one thing. The other thing to think about is preparing ourselves, how we dress. What are we going to wear for that particular...
Everyone's going to be now judging us as we say this, of course, Colin, which is a bit of a concern. So I better check whether or not I've been ironed the shirt properly this morning.
They both know that we own a clean shirt each, which that's a good start. But I think there are some choices that you and I have made, whether consciously or not, about, for example, whether or not to wear a jacket today, whether or not to wear a tie. And I think we need to strike a happy balance really between formality and informality. But if in doubt, my advice would be go for a slightly more formal approach than you think is necessary. Because it's always possible, if you've arrived with a jacket and a tie, it's always possible to take the tie off subtly or to remove your jacket without it seeming to be awkward. But it's hugely disconcerting if you've sort of suddenly to rush off and find a jacket because everybody else in the room
Yeah, and I think it is a really important piece, and I've certainly interviewed people that I'm more interested in what they're saying, of course, but I can't help but notice if I feel that they're perhaps not quite dressed for the occasion. So I think that's a very, very valid piece of advice. And one of the other things, of course, to think about is the culture of the organisation that you're going to be interviewed by, or for that matter, if you're, having a meeting, is to kind of be emotionally intelligent about that and think to yourself, okay, if this is an organisation where I can see from the photographs on their website that they tend to be a suit and tie or a formal business suit, obviously for women, then you need to be thinking about whether you can properly reflect that. I think would you agree, Colin?
Absolutely. No, it's the cultural aspect comes in, but also don't forget that in the presentational world, how you're dressed, what accoutrements you have with you, down to the other things that one is wearing: watches, rings, earrings, glasses. I mean, all of that goes towards the non-verbal communication part of presenting yourself. So if you wear glasses, that's fine. Of course it is. It's not a problem to accommodate that, but recognize that those things that you have a choice over are going to be making one or other statement. Do they match the occasion? But more particularly, do they really match you? So not the day possibly to wear your Mickey Mouse watch if you are, in that mode, you've just forgotten to change it, unless you recognize that, the corporate culture, for want of an analogy, reflects the Disney world. I don't know why it shouldn't.
Yeah, very good. Just go take you back a second. You talked about the room and the stage, which I think is a great analogy, because there's always an element of acting. Colin is also a voice actor, by the way, for those that don't know him, and you'll probably be able to tell that from his wonderful cadences. But tell us a little bit more about that stage piece. Any top tips you can give us in terms of checking the background, the lighting, and this kind of thing?
Well, I think it's really important to do, and not just once. My advice on this is just 5 minutes before each and every meeting, even if it's just, in inverted commas, just a meeting, but particularly before an interview, make sure you get online, and whatever the platform is that you're using, it might be Microsoft Teams or Zoom, and there are various others, Blue Jeans and lots of other platforms coming online every day at the moment. But all of them will allow you to check your settings, to check the background. So if you haven't got, as I have here today, for example, a neutral background set up behind you, if you're obliged to present somewhere where there's, quite properly real life happening, then what is the real life today? Does it include a basket full of laundry in the corner that you just haven't spotted till you sit down? So give that view a critical look each time you come back to it. Remember also, lighting is a point that you're picking up on, Nigel, quite rightly, and that lighting changes during the day, and it can change even during the course of, let's say, a 1-hour interview. If you're sitting beside a window, you have one to your side there, and that is a good example. If suddenly it's been a grey morning and the sun comes out, or it moves round, and you know that at 10:30 in the morning your interview starts at 10, and at 10:30 the sun is normally streaming full volume into that room, recognize that, prepare for that, make sure that it doesn't suddenly change the whole focus of the camera, quite literally. And make sure that you're not then going to be sitting in silhouette. These are things over which you don't appear to have huge control, but which you can prepare for.
Yeah. So if you're in getting your video running beforehand, and perhaps even recording yourself, can be very beneficial, can't it? I mean, it's awkward for some people that are not used to seeing themselves recorded or hearing themselves recorded, but nonetheless, I think it's a very valuable thing that you're saying there, because if it can be very distracting. I watched somebody. I mean, all of us recently must have seen people on the news where they, politicians who should know better, where you can only see the top of their head, or they're leaning right into the camera, or there's too much light or too little light, and all of these things can be prepared for, can't they? So,
Well, absolutely they can. The classic mistake, which is repeated, you're quite right, nightly on the news by very senior figures, is to have a laptop on a desk with the screen arched back, so that all we get is a view of the chin and less attractively
and very pleasantly looking up their nose, which is
up
not
their
so
nose,
great.
and more importantly, then, no, not more importantly, but more distractingly, a couple of ceiling lights or a glaring light there, or the corner of something else which we just can't see. No ceilings. We don't need ceilings. We like to talk to people eye to eye. So whatever it takes, however many telephone directories or books, or just buy a laptop stand, not expensive thing, and make sure that, as near as possible, the camera is at eye level, if not even possibly slightly above, so that it can get.
And you talked about, when we were talking earlier, you talked about distraction, and a lot of those things obviously are related to that. But could you expand on that for the viewers and listeners a little, to what you mean by that and what can be avoided?
Okay, so again, if you've got a window beside you, are you at ground level? Do people constantly walk past that window the whole time? That would be a distraction. You can mitigate against that by having a set of elegant blinds, for example. You can make sure that the things, again, in the background, if you've got a favourite poster or picture, or you've got a bookshelf with books in it, believe me, people are going to be looking at those books. They are at some point, even if not consciously, going to notice that you are, I don't know, that your interests are in gardening, or that they're in Italian wine, or whatever it may be. The spines of those books are going to be visible. You have a choice as to what is there. If it adds to you and it's part of you, and it gives, quite fairly, the interviewer a chance to say, Nigel, I can't help noticing, but you appear to be a keen gardener. Is that right? That's great, because that actually is a very legitimate thing. But just make sure it's appropriate and that it matches. And anything that doesn't need to be there, that doesn't actually add to you, your personality, your character, your abilities, your interests, then for the purposes of that video, just keep it to one side.
No, very good. And we touched on some of the familiarity with the platform and so on, and how to look. You also, in our discussion earlier, you talked about screen sharing and being familiar with the IT. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because I think interviews specifically, this is a very, very important element of getting over information that you may have. And we'll probably do another one of these podcasts on what I'd call the formal presentation side of selection processes. So we won't go into that in detail today, but perhaps you can, if somebody says, or feels that they want to share a page, talk me through some of the pitfalls and ways of preparing yourself for that, if you could, please.
Well, it's a big topic, Nigel. It's one that we could spend a great deal of time talking about in depth. But I think a couple of top tips there, if they help. The first is, be familiar again with that particular platform. For example, if you are asked to join an interview on Microsoft Teams and you've spent most of your time on Zoom or any other platform, again, make sure you know how to share your screen on that. If you're being asked to share your CV and discuss it, or if you're being asked to share something that you prepared, and it might indeed be a full presentation. If it is, let's say it's a full presentation, you've again got a choice. And this is a hint, this is a tip here, because Microsoft PowerPoint, for example, the moment you press it, the presenter view on PowerPoint, it fills your whole screen. And all you can see, admittedly, what the others are seeing at the other end as well, are your slides. But rather alarmingly for you, the Zoom view, the Microsoft Teams view disappears, and that can put you off your stride. I mean, that can be really quite a shock. Again, if you're not used to doing it, there are dozens of caveats to this. There are lots of ways in which, in fact, you can share your slides in not in full presenter mode, but in notes mode. Some very good videos online. I'd encourage anyone to go off and have a look at all this stuff. But it all comes under the head of preparation. And if you're going to try one of those alternative methods, for heaven's sake, don't do it live for the first time, thinking, well, I watched a video on this 3 days ago. I think I can remember what the sequence is, and then get it wrong. Because principally what you'll do is distract yourself. And of course, that's just, I'm afraid, going to destroy.
Or possibly the worst. The worst scenario would be where you shared something that you hadn't intended to share, or perhaps your untidy desktop, which would
that's
be
always a risk. That's always perhaps a risk. Absolutely, yeah. But it's more to do. I mean, just to give you an alternative that sounds more positive, perhaps. One of the things that PowerPoint allows you to do, or if you're a Mac user, Keynote, obviously, is to be able to export your presentation as a PDF. Now, you don't necessarily think of Adobe Acrobat Reader as a presentation tool, but if you export it as a PDF, you can resize it to any size you like. You can still show just that so that whoever is watching sees those slides, but you can also have alongside you on your single screen, you can have your presentation and you can have the Zoom call, the Teams call happening as well, so that you don't lose touch and you get some visual feedback, for example, as you're going, which can be all important, particularly if you're needing to manage time carefully, which we all do.
And I think one of the other elements to that as well which is really interesting and potential benefit of having an interview on a video format, is there's nothing to stop you from having, Post-it notes stuck round the screen, or having some pieces of paper in front of you, as I have at the moment. I have some notes in front of me. And of course, unlike when you sit down in somebody else's office, that can't be seen. So, and in fact, I was talking with somebody recently about doing an interview for non-English speakers, non-native English speakers, and I was saying that if there are phrases or whatever that they struggle with, then it might be sensible, if they're being interviewed via video, is to put those phrases on a post-it and stick it on the bottom of their screen. And again, this is the preparation, and preparation, I think.
Or depending on where the camera is, Nigel, depending on where the camera is, possibly on the top of the screen, even if they're half notes rather than full notes, because the closer you can maintain your look to the camera itself, the more alive and human you're going to be. The more we do that, the more we look down and look at a note down, in my case, at the bottom of my screen there, or, as it were, worse still, on my desk. The more we're spotted doing that, the more the interviewer knows that that's a moment where we're picking up our notes, picking up our cues. But it's perfectly easy you could have a Microsoft Word document or a Pages document open with some of those phrases and simply have them in a font alongside your camera
indeed,
top of the screen in landscape mode. And actually, it's a very simple thing just to flick from there to there to check those phrases or those numbers, or the key points that you want to make in little bullets. You could have that, as you rightly say, on screen. So yes, that's definitely an advantage. But the key here is try not to be flicking round the room and around your screen or around your desk if you can, because it's just going to look more polished.
And that kind of brings on to sort of one of the other key areas, I think, which is that kind of performance piece of which in some respects is easier for some people than it is for others, and this equally applies to a face-to-face interview as it does. But in terms of how the person is, what can you give the viewer, the listener, in terms of advice for how to sort of present themselves in that kind of performance sense?
The single most effective thing that we can do in the real world and online is to rehearse. Rehearse in real time with someone. Again, even if it's just recording yourself, as you suggested earlier, and maybe doing a 10-minute recording of you answering some questions or asking some questions relevant to that interview. And the the next time that you come to answer or ask those questions will feel very much more natural if you've rehearsed them. And make sure that you don't have something in your head or in your unspoken script that is actually a tripwire. If you're applying for a job and the job title includes statistics or statistician, just rehearse it. Make sure that you don't get a fit of the jitters on the day, and plenty of people stumble over that and lots of other words. So you can find, if you have to refer to statistics the whole time, people will understand if you just talk about stats. We know what stats are.
Yeah, it's an interesting one actually, because I was watching a program the other day on a lady that is a BBC producer, and she suffers with a stammer. And she said that pretty much exactly what you were saying there, that certain words, she's trained herself over the years to avoid certain words that she finds difficult. And it is well, you heard me just slightly stammering then. There is a method of dealing with things which might make you feel a little bit more anxious, perhaps, and
speed.
Certainly rehearsing those sort of answers.
Rehearsing those.
Really, really
What
useful.
tends to happen, of course, is that our brains speed up under some form of pressure. When our brains speed up, we speak more quickly. So we need to force ourselves to practice speaking at a clear pace and a comprehensible pace. And as again in the real world, don't forget the allies that are pauses and repetition. So if I pause to say something, and pauses are really powerful, the moment I pause, you instantly replay that last sentence in your head. So it doesn't feel natural. In the real world, it can sometimes feel like minutes are passing when it's seconds only. But pauses and repetition help with this process of getting the right speed. They help with clarity, but particularly they help those who are listening to us or watching us to assimilate and record and remember to the point where they can then repeat them, the points that we're wishing to make. It's not a technique one can use all the time, but if you look at those who are world dominant speakers, and you just have to think back a few years to how Barack Obama, for example, developed his own speaking style. He would go from one word to the next with not just gaps, but 6-lane highways between them. But that element of rhetoric that he endorsed and then made his own is an extreme example of what I'm saying. So you can come across some of that.
What about the energy side?
Well, some of that comes across too, because if you're confident enough to hold yourself in that way and resist the temptation to gabble because you have got a point and all of a sudden it's very interesting and you really want to get it across because, oh, and another thing. I mean, that may be how you're feeling, but you've got to dial everything down so that it becomes at a measurable pace. And
what about people who maybe struggle at the other end of the spectrum rather than the person that wants to get everything out? What about those people? I mean, we all know that at interviews, people say, "Oh, you've got to have energy. You've got to show enthusiasm." If somebody's a more reserved individual, I mean, there's a lot of nonsense talked about introverts and extroverts, but you know what I mean. Somebody who finds talking a lot is perhaps not their most natural strength. What would you suggest for them to overcome this thing where they can demonstrate energy and drive, even though they might not be as verbose as some others, perhaps?
Well, I think the point that I would emphasize for them is use the camera, It's there, it's looking at you. It's something that we have to overcome in this world, the fact that we can see ourselves on screen at the time that we're presenting, which we don't have to do in the world outside. But it is, on the other hand, as we've discussed in terms of setting the stage, it can be a method of changing our appeal. And if you want to make a particular point or ask a particular question, even if you're at the shyer, more reserved end of the stage, then look straight into the camera and say, when you're asked, do you have any questions for us, for example, say, yes, I've been looking and been thinking. Make that appeal direct, make it personal. Now, it doesn't matter where you are on the ability to talk scale. These are things that will demonstrate your personality, that will add positive energy to the event and to the occasion, and demonstrate that you are there in person. So in a very definite way, you can utilize the technology to your advantage. And I think the big point that I would make on that is never forget that in this Zoom Teams world, it's a great leveler. Nobody, the chief executive of the biggest company in the richest country, gets exactly the same size postage stamp on your screen as you and everybody else. So if it's just you and one other, still you have equal billing with the other personal people on the screen, on your screen at the time. And it's a real leveler. It really is. Because whilst you've done everything, or thought it through, and you've made all the preparation and taken away all the distractions that you can plan to remove, have they? Perhaps they haven't. Perhaps they'll be surprised by the cat coming in because they'd forgotten they'd left the door open. It's actually not an opportunity to trip each other up at all. I don't wish to intimate that. But remember that whilst in the boardroom they sit in the bigger chair at the end of the table and you don't, at home they sit at their kitchen table or in their office, and so do you. So there's no them and us.
I mean, that's a really lovely point, actually. Thank you, Colin, because that's a lovely point to finish on. And one of my philosophies that people who have seen me present on things and seen some of the things that I've written, particularly if you follow me on LinkedIn, will know that one of my key things I talk about, and I coach companies on how to interview as well, is that this is a two-way street. It doesn't matter how important that person is, they are still a human being. And that's a lovely point to make, actually, the kind of democratization of the interview process, which is driven by a video conference. And people sometimes do suffer anxiety because they think that the person interviewing them is kind of up here and they're down here. And of course, one of the things I say on that, by the way, is that the person who's interviewing you, they probably feel under as much pressure to make sure that they hire the right person as you feel under pressure to find the right job. So it is very much, sorry to use a cliche, but it is very much a two-way street. And I love that comment, that remark there that Colin made, which is that this process, if anything, makes it even more of a two-way street, and even more even. So that's great, Colin. Thank you so much. Those are really all very, very useful points that we've discussed there, I think, on utilising video conference for interviews. And in fact, those of you that might be watching or listening to this who are interviewers could also learn a huge amount from this, because in fact all of the points that Colin has made pretty much apply to the interviewer as well as the interviewee. So please follow Colin on LinkedIn. Colin, do you want to, any other areas where people can find you to access your information and also the other things that you do?
Thank you, Nigel. I mean, I'm not hard to find on the net generally. Colin W D McLean, I think if that name is up on screen, that's the one to look out for. various things. My business is presentation work, so it's presw.com is the website there. LinkedIn is the best place to start, because from there, if you're interested in any of the other things, the voice acting, which you generously mentioned, or my YouTube channel, or various other interests that I've got, that's a good place to start. So thank you. LinkedIn, probably the best initial contact.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Colin, and I'm sure everyone watching or listening to this will have thoroughly enjoyed it, and have hopefully come away with some tips which will potentially improve their performance when they go along for interview, and anything which gives you that little bit of an edge, as I often say, might mean the difference between not getting a really great opportunity for the future and achieving it. So hopefully Colin today has helped you in that endeavour. Thank you very much for listening and watching.